Okay. 3 minutes after, so we should probably dive in. Well, thanks for coming. I'm excited to talk about this topic, leverage points for designers and players. My name is Jamey Stevenson. I'm the co-founder of Tech Valley Gamespace, which is a community of game developers in Troy, New York. And let's dive into it. So, what are leverage points? Anybody here familiar with leverage points already as a concept? I figured maybe audience of game developers, and we're at MIT, so if there was a crowd that already would be familiar, it'd be here. Well, leverage points are places within a complex system where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes, often in everything. They're natural focal points for designers looking to refine their game systems, and they're also central sources of power and agency for players when they're acting within the dynamic system of your game. It's worth noting that designers and players typically have differing relationships with the leverage points in a game. From the designer's perspective, you'll have the ability to customize the entire system, generally speaking, and so you can create new leverage points, you can remove leverage points, you can strengthen or weaken them, depending on whether or not you're getting the kind of desired dynamics that you want. Of course, the designer also chooses which leverage points to expose to players, for the most part, barring bugs and exploits and things that aren't intended. And you also, as the designer, get to choose kind of how obscure to make the leverage points, which can be very important. You might think, kind of if you're coming from a user interface design background, that the best thing is just to make all the leverage points really clear and transparent and make it very apparent how to use them. But often kind of discovering these leverage points and figuring out how to utilize them is part of the pleasure of discovery for players. So there's a balance to consider there. But from the player's perspective, they utilize leverage points and kind of it's part of mastering the system of your game, is kind of discovering them and figuring out how to use them to affect changes. And it's worth noting as well, some leverage points within a system are not generally exposed to players, so they might be things that only the designer has control over, such as probability distributions for aspects of procedural generation, things like this that are really just meant for the designer to adjust things. In the book Systems Thinking for Social Change, David Peter Stroh observes that systems are perfectly designed to produce the results and behavior that they are currently producing. I think this is just as true for games as it is for real-world systems, and it's an important lesson in both cases. If your game is producing undesirable experiences, chances are the root cause can be traced back to your underlying game mechanics and system structure. Fixing broken systems can often be challenging and counterintuitive. So, I don't want to present leverage points as a magic bullet for accomplishing that. They're certainly not. But they are a fundamental ingredient for reforming the mechanics of your game in order to produce more desirable dynamics and player experiences. Donella Meadows famously produced this list, which identifies 12 different places to intervene within a system to affect change and to push the behavior towards a desired outcome. Meadows' insights are relevant for designers and players alike. Meadows originally arranged this list of leverage points in order of increasing effectiveness, so 12 being kind of the least leverage and 1 being the most. But a lot of that ordering, it's worth noting, was based on the assumption that we're discussing real-world systems rather than necessarily something like a game or a simulation, which tends to be more malleable. So some of the items that Donella Meadows placed as lower leverage points, or those offering less leverage, were placed there partially because they're very inflexible in real-world systems and very difficult to alter, but that may not be the case for our purposes. So I think it's worth taking we're going to go through them in the order that Meadows originally presented them. And we're going to kind of look at examples of each. But again, the order is probably not the thing to focus on too much. Even in Meadows' original essay discussing this, she freely admitted that the order was open to interpretation. So let's start with the first leverage point on the list, parameters. This can be a little bit counterintuitive. It's often also described as numbers, which to me as a designer and a programmer was initially very counterintuitive because like it's a digital game, isn't it all numbers ultimately? So what do you mean they're low leverage? I don't understand. So as Donella Meadows defines parameters, they're specifically numerical values associated with non-structural elements of the system, such as the rate of various individual taps and sinks, so like the rate at which resources get produced and consumed, and so on. Because the system structure itself has such a profound and often overriding effect on the dynamics that emerge, these non-structural values often don't provide much leverage. However, Meadows points out that the rate of particular taps and sinks can still have a short-term experiential impact on individuals operating directly within their flow. So when you're thinking of the overall behavior of the system as a whole, they may not be high leverage, but for an individual operator within that system, it might have a profound effect still on their experience, and that's important to keep in mind. So while they might be the lowest leverage point according to Meadows' conception, they are still a leverage point. And they become more powerful as they go into ranges that kick off some of the leverage points further along in the list. So a lot of those are still controlled by numbers and parameters. And so parameters that affect those will have more leverage, generally speaking, for affecting change. Within natural systems, and often artificial systems as well, they've sort of evolved or been designed to stay within safe ranges that don't produce those types of cascading effects. But with our games, we don't necessarily design them that way. So there are a lot of real-world examples that Meadows uses, but let's move on to a game example. So if you think of Mario, right, we could change lots of values within Mario. There's lots of parameters we could tweak within the series as a whole. In the original game, we could tweak, say, instead of making it 100 coins to get an extra life, could make it 50, could make it 20. And it probably wouldn't have a very deep effect on Mario as a system, especially. In Super Mario Odyssey, they effectively made 10 coins an extra life since they removed lives entirely as a concept, and they just made it so you lose 10 coins whenever you die. And that change, was also not necessarily something that profoundly changed what Mario is as an experience, as a system. But there were some other changes that were more structural changes that were a bit more interesting. For example, they also tied coins in with purchasing new outfits and things. So they essentially changed some of the taps and sinks associated with the resource and made it so that the penalty was associated with a resource that you want to use for other purposes, as opposed to lives, which are sort of just are what they are, generally speaking. So that's one example of tweaking a parameter and how it could have some effect on the experience. If we tripled the amount of coins that you lose in Super Mario Odyssey when you lose a life, make things a little more challenging, but it wouldn't necessarily have a massive effect on the dynamics. Moving along, buffers are the next leverage point, and buffers refer to the sizes of containers and the maximum value or stock that they can hold before they are full and at capacity. Containers with a large capacity relative to the flow of the resource that they store tend to provide stability within a system. They sort of insulate against fluctuations in resource flows within your game system. So things like supply and demand and production and consumption, they kind of provide a buffer there. However, they can also cause inflexibility by slowing down the circulation of resources through the system. So the kind of canonical example of this is like a bathtub, right? The tap is the literal tap, and the sink is the drain, and the amount of water would be the sort of metaphor for the value that's stored within the buffer. The same reason, the same concept behind a bank account, savings or credit limit, inventory for a store, and things like this. These are all different examples of buffers. Sticking with my Nintendo theme for now, we will diverge. So let's take the example of the Legend of Zelda. We could crank up the number of hearts that get generated when enemies are defeated. We can make it like 100% probability. But if we're still kind of at the early portion of the game, where we only have a maximum capacity of 3 hearts in our meter, it's not necessarily going to make that much of a difference. It could make a difference later if we have kind of a larger pool of hearts and the ability to store more of them. But the important thing to keep in mind is that this is about the size of the buffer relative to the flow of resources, right? So if we made a lot of hearts spawn within the game, but we kept the maximum heart meter at 3, and all enemies did like 5 hearts of damage every hit, then it's not really going to make much of a difference to change the number of hearts in the world. Next leverage point, stock and flow structures. This is defined as the physical arrangement of stocks and flows that system resources must kind of inhabit and travel through. So it's really about the physical material components and their layout and composition, kind of their nodes of intersection, and all these things can drastically impact throughput of resources within a system. As you'll know if you've ever been stuck in traffic, right? And all these things have an impact on the functional dynamics for players. This is why stock and flow structures are common sources of bottlenecks, as noted. And while these tend to be very expensive and difficult to change in reality in many cases, which is, again, part of the reason why Meadows has them as kind of lower leverage, within our games, they can be much more malleable. And they can really provide a really fun challenge for players in, say, a simulation game, just to manipulate the flow and transfer of resources and these sorts of traffic networks. There's other games as well, so we don't have to just stick with simulation. So let's think about Overcooked. So in Overcooked, you can only carry an item at a time, so you have these kind of throughput limits of just carrying items and transporting them to where they need to go to perform the next transformation on them. And this is actually a fundamental element of Overcooked, as noted by the designers. This was sort of the original prototype of kind of the core of Overcooked, is just this idea that you have some barrier that you can't hop over, but if you have 2 players working together, you can pass a resource over this barrier and much more quickly move objects from point A to point B. Now obviously there's lots of other complications on top of that, but this is kind of the core, and I think it's a really good example of utilizing stock and flow structures as an interesting leverage point for players. There's plenty of other games. I think inventory management in Resident Evil is an interesting one to look at, how that's kind of been altered in various games in the series. Anything that involves kind of physical transport often involves stock and flow structures. So like resource mining in StarCraft. Obviously things like transportation networks in SimCity map very closely to real world example. Next leverage point is delays, defined as the lengths of time between changes in the system state and reactive updates to system behavior. So when there are corrections and adjustments and they end up being delayed, what tends to happen is they tend to cause these oscillations, right? Where they're sort of overshooting and undershooting the target system state that they're trying to maintain or produce. Delays can arise due to the time it takes to become aware of a relevant state change. So what we define as a sensory delay. So if you get the information late, that's one type of delay. If you just happen to be delayed in the way that you respond to the information, so even if the information is timely, if your response is delayed, then that's another significant form of delay. And of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. One important thing to keep in mind is that the significance of a delay again, it's relative, right? It's relative to the rate of change in the system, relevant system change. So, sticking with the very hygienic examples, Meadows cites an example of using a shower in a hotel in London where the heater was, down in the bottom floor and the shower was up on a higher floor, and there was no kind of buffering at all. And it took about a minute in between changing, the hot and cold knob to actually have the change come through, right? And you can kind of guess what that experience might have been like. So that's an example of a real-world delay. Centralized planning systems kind of notoriously often end up with some of these things. Kind of large bureaucratic entities. There are examples within our own body, of course, and lots of examples. Let's look at a game example. So there's a really good GDC talk, which I recommend to those who haven't seen it. It's a very detailed talk about a balance adjustment that was made to Halo 3 to the multiplayer to change the time between shots for the sniper rifle from 0.5 seconds to 0.7 seconds, and the massive effect that had on the dynamics. So again, going back to like the numbers and parameters, right? Like that is a very small parameter change, but because it's connected with the ability of a player to respond in a very rapidly changing environment, as Halo battle can be, then it kind of ties in with this delay lever. And so there's more leverage associated with that change. Any number of other, shooters have this. The original Resident Evil and the sort of much derided tank controls, which I personally love, is another example, right? Zombies coming at you, and you have to very slowly turn. So this is sort of an imposed delay on the player. Interestingly, again, because it's relative, so like Resident Evil 4, which moved towards much faster ability to kind of aim and shoot, was then able to, as a consequence, throw a lot more enemies much more quickly at you. So they kind of were able to alter the experience, but still keep the relative delays similar, in my view. Lots and lots of, if you ever played a game with a low frame rate or played an online game that was lagging, there's lots of examples of this sort of thing. Balancing feedback loops is our next one. So these are system components that attempt to keep a particular value within equilibrium. So they're kind of a loop where they monitor some aspect of the system. They have some sort of goal state that they're trying to keep that aspect of the system within, such as sort of a certain value range. And if it goes outside of that range, they have some way of affecting the system to kind of bring things back within that range. They're ubiquitous in both natural and artificial systems. And a big part of the reason why is they help provide longevity, stability. They make the system more resilient. That said, if the current system state is undesirable, then they can also be obstacles to reform or disruption. So they're sort of preservationist by nature. The ability of balancing feedback loops to maintain equilibrium is determined by the strength and timeliness of their feedback relative to the state changes that they're trying to correct. So again, you can get out of range of these things. The classical example of this is a thermostat and a kind of heating and cooling system, right, that's trying to maintain the value of whatever room temperature you've set it to maintain. Here's a great example of balancing feedback loops. Super Mario Kart as a series is full of them. And I like this picture of Super Mario Kart because to me this is my conception of like what the designers want Mario Kart to be, which is like everybody clumped together as closely as possible in the race. And I can see why they strive for that, right? It's more exciting that way in many cases. A lot more opportunity for player interactions. So some of the balancing feedback loops within Mario Kart as a series, there's ones like rubber band AI that are fairly well known, right? Like if you're playing against a computer player and you're ahead, then the computers will often artificially speed up to catch you to kind of make it so you can't get too far away often. Some players are not a fan of this. A lot of players aren't a fan of most of these aspects. There are some that are a little more covert that are in there as well that less people complain about. For instance, if you look at a distribution of the item probabilities within Mario Kart when you get an item, they're impacted by your distance from the player that's in first place. So as you get further back in the pack, you tend to get better items that give you a better chance of catching up again. Blue shells, Mario Kart is full of this stuff. In terms of a game, just another example where the leverage point is really exposed to players. Settlers of Catan, just the kind of trade mechanic inherently allows you to impose these trade embargoes. So you might have played a game of Settlers of Catan where somebody is clearly pulling ahead and the other players kind of team up to not trade with them to kind of slow down their progress. That's another example of sort of a balancing feedback loop that has players within the loop able to control it. Then you have reinforcing feedback loops. So these, I think a lot of us are familiar with. They're sort of these exponential situations where the system's rate of change is amplified by its value, and it sort of creates this amplification effect where you get sort of exponential growth or exponential collapse. And because of this kind of exponential nature, these tend to be sort of agents of chaos. They do push a system in a singular direction. And so that direction can often, as it kind of goes up the exponential curve, can kind of break a lot of the limits of the system. It can bring things outside of the range of where balancing feedback loops can actually correct things, and it can cause very catastrophic and dramatic effects within a system. So often this is, I think cogently listed as a larger leverage point than a balancing feedback loop by Meadows. And that's because often reducing the gain around these sorts of positive feedback loops can be a more effective leverage point than trying to introduce or strengthen balancing feedback loops to keep up with them. This is the canonical example here. Monopoly, originally conceived as the landlord's game, was effectively just a reinforcing feedback loop done as a critique of certain aspects of rent practices and capitalistic practices at the time. And anything that has a sort of success to the successful system within it is an example of a reinforcing feedback loop. Katamari Damacy might be maybe a more fun one. Next leverage point is information flows, defined as the structure of who does and does not have access to pertinent information. Healthy communication structures with components and stakeholders having access to relevant information and feedback about the operation of the system is essential for detecting problems and addressing dysfunctional behavior. That said, you may have noticed there's a natural impulse among those benefiting from a system in its current form to avoid scrutiny and the potential systemic reforms that come with it. So real-world aspects that tie into this, might think of journalism and different political leaders' views of journalism that they try to spread, government surveillance, tragedy of the commons type scenarios, and so on. There's lots of interesting examples of using information flows as a leverage point in games. Poker and bluffing, I think, again, would be like a fairly typical example. Any game that involves sort of fog of war and scouting to get information and then reacting to some limited observability would be an example. Games like Hanabi and Space Team that really center around like information throughput and sort of like signal to noise and sort of inferring things make very interesting use of these leverage points. Anything involving team communication as well, team games like Dota. Rules seems like a pretty intuitive leverage point, I would think, for most game designers, right? Don't need to spend too much time explaining what rules are. One interesting note is that Meadows also classifies things like rewards and punishments under rules, which may not be intuitive to us as game designers necessarily. At least it wasn't to me. I like this quote from Meadows. She says that if you want to understand the deepest malfunctions of systems, pay attention to the rules and who has power over them. In our case, us as designers. we're the evil ones behind the curtain. Just an example I think is interesting of making rules a leverage point would be a card game like Magic. where a lot of the cards alter the rules within the game. So, that's really turning over like a lot of power to players to kind of define these things each game. Twitch Plays Pokemon was another entertaining example of this, with anarchy versus democracy. Getting close to the end of our leverage points here, self-organization, very interesting one. So this is defined as the ability to add, change, or evolve system structure. Self-organization involves profoundly transformative processes like learning, evolution, technological advance, and social revolution. It allows a system such as an organism or a culture to adapt and thrive within a diverse and highly variable environment. In this way, it is the ultimate form of resilience. There's some good examples from games as well of self-organization. I think Minecraft is a good go-to, especially things like Redstone within Minecraft and sort of simulation of electrical current that then people are able to do so many different interesting things with. Player governance within EVE Online is an interesting example, I think. An example that I don't know as much about, admittedly, so I won't dwell on it too much. Things that just allow different ways to approach a problem, so Zachtronics puzzle games. Any game that allows mods, or any of you who've set up a house rule for a game, these are all forms of self-organization. Goals, another one that as game designers I think we're pretty familiar with. What's interesting is, so what we might think of as a goal, or what we might say is our own goal, is not necessarily always what Meadows means when she discusses the goal. She often describes the goal as just the behavior that the system is producing now, rather than the sort of like espoused purpose of the thing. But the important thing to realize, I think, is the goal is this animating force, right? It provides this underlying motivation, and it has an inherent pull to it. It tends to bend system structure towards it, assuming that the goal is sort of accepted by those who have control over the system. And goals, therefore, kind of imbue a system with an intrinsic set of values, in my opinion. So they're very value-charged things. So a real-world example might be, say, like economic growth as a goal versus sustainability, and all the implications that come along with pursuing one goal or another. Is this my favorite current example of making goals, if not a leverage point, then just exploring the implications of goals within the game. Has anybody played this, Universal Paperclips? Highly recommended, clicker game. Without giving away too much, so it's based on this sort of nightmare scenario conception of an AI that is optimizing for creating as many paperclips as possible. And what might happen if an AI managed to become very efficient at doing that. You play as the AI in the game. So again, this is just the idea of like, what do you do when you're optimizing for a goal, and what are the implications when we have other people or machines optimize for a particular goal, right? Have we thought through the ramifications of that? One other example, there's a great article by Anna Spargo-Ryan, which I recommend in The Guardian, talking about an experience she had playing Fallout 76, which I haven't played, but if it's anything like Fallout, I imagine it's a fairly bleak presentation. But she encountered this group of super nice dads within the game who just, you can construct things within the game, and they kind of just, she was new to the game, and they built this whole palace for her, essentially. It just like came in and did very nice things. So, contrary to what maybe the goals might be or what the game might be leading you towards, there's still the opportunity to resist within that structure. Speedrunning being another example, right? People who just completely discard what the original intended goal of the game was, and do what they like. Last two, so paradigm. This is an interesting one. So this is defined as the mindset out of which the system arises. So all of the elements of a system, a design system, its goals, structure, rules, delays, parameters, and more, are shaped by the deeply held beliefs and values of the creators of that system. So our individual and collective notions and understanding form the basis of our artificial and social systems and how we interact with the natural systems around us. This is why in order to truly affect meaningful systemic change and reform, we first need to change the perceptions and beliefs held by ourselves and others. So when you're, posting something about your beliefs online and people tell you you're not doing anything to actually affect change, you are. I think these are some of my favorite games, are examples of games that challenge existing paradigms, right? This is The Endless Forest, just one of many wonderful games by Tale of Tales. And Tale of Tales, their games are worth playing, and their writing about games is really worth reading. They explicitly have taken an approach of thinking beyond games as a label and as a paradigm. So all of the things that come with us thinking of these things we create as games, all the things we think a game should be, they just kind of discard that. Say like, well, it doesn't need to be a game. Why does it need to be a game? And as a result, they produce really interesting work. Johann Sebastian Joust, I think, is another interesting example, like a digitally mediated game that just kind of discards the screen as a paradigm. Brecode's self-care game / app, Electroplankton, Undertale, games that play around with paradigms and expectations. These are all really interesting examples. Last leverage point, as they kind of go up, they get increasingly sort of philosophical, which I like about this list. Transcendence, defined as the ability to sort of remain unattached or unaffiliated to any single paradigm, to not get too rigid about these things, and to maintain the capacity to think critically about the implications that different viewpoints have on the systems produced by those that espouse them. So just to finish this leverage point thing with another quote from Meadows, which I love. It is in this space of mastery over paradigms that people throw off addictions, live in constant joy, bring down empires, get locked up, or burned at the stake, or crucified or shot, and have impacts that last for millennia. It's difficult sometimes to think of what the examples here are, but it's a fun thought exercise. To me, an interesting one at the moment, and full disclosure, I spent the past 2 years as a designer at DeepMind, so I'm a little biased, potentially, but I think the work being done by DeepMind on things like AlphaGo and AlphaZero in particular, and the way that all these kind of accrued wisdoms and paradigms that humans had formed about these very deep games over long periods of time were kind of counteracted, or in some sense, we were able to glean new insight on them based on observing what an AI did when it learned to approach these systems from scratch without any human data as an influence. And AlphaZero is, I think, the most interesting example of that, because it did learn to play multiple games without any human data as a reference point. And as a result, the paradigm it forms is sort of unbounded, untethered to those things in interesting ways. There's also a good paper which I recommend on automated game design, as long as we're talking about AI and transcendence. So that's my talk. Thanks for bearing with me. I know I went a couple minutes long, but we also started late, so I appreciate it. I just flashed this up. I know they're videotaping, so hopefully you can go back to this later, but these are some interesting reference points and reading if you want to learn more about these topics. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions, or if you want to just talk to me, if that's easier.
maybe just like ask for some general wisdom as someone who's interested in game design and also like systems design, especially particularly when using games to impact real world impacts and culture, whatever. Also, I don't know, you're working for deep, what is it, deep zero? Deep Alpha Zero. I'm a chess player, so. But any advice to like where to look into that intersection of game design and system design?
I can tell you my favorite sort of like working designers, sure, which I didn't mention this, but Doris Ruch is I think doing some of the most compelling work.
I'll write this down. Doris
Ruch.
How do you spell that?
Doris D-O-R-S and then Ruch R-U-S-C-H.
What's she working on?
So she until recently was a professor at DePaul University, and I believe also was at MIT at some point a while back. She does games that are often like metaphorical in nature, and that kind of use systems as metaphors. It's a sort of like procedural metaphor stuff, which is really fun. And she also makes games that are often themed around topics related to things like mental illness, like different topics, and co-designs them with people who have like lived experience with whatever the game happens to be about.
Awesome.
And yeah, she wrote an amazing book, which is like my favorite game design book. Came out in the past few years. It's called Making Deep Games. Love it. It's really good.
Sounds up your alley.
Yeah, highly recommended. Yeah, I think you'd be into it.
I just graduated with a master's at Emerson at the Engagement Lab for civic media, and so that was all about like participatory co-design kind of stuff. So that sounds, you're right, good on that. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you going to be around tomorrow as well?
I don't think so. I barely made it here for this. I have to go back because I'm actually just like visiting family.
Oh, great. Well, glad you can make it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And good luck with the work.
Oh, garbage. I'm a trash person. I didn't get the camera. Am I even?